can start here.
And then he'll chime in. He'll be writing a few
You'll be from that. Well, they have the report, so. Let's trust Apple here and start in. Oh, you can post it, okay? O Toledo. O Todd. E o Fábio. Look at that. Ó, minuto.
Thank you. So when were you in Brazil?
So late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay.
I left 10 years ago, actually.
Okay. Do you go back?
My wife was Brazilian. So
Okay.
I mean, I was spending a lot of time there. A couple of years, especially.
I haven't been there in a couple of years. Last time I was there was, I guess, October 2012, so almost.
Oh, Michael.
Are you going back to present this at all? Or?
Good there.
Were you presenting this in Brazil at all?
I may be going.
Well, good morning.
Maybe going in October.
Right.
And these numbers now. So these numbers.
I think we have to start on time because we have discussants in São Paulo, and we are going to do this the modern way, which begins by starting on time. Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Paulo Sotero, director of the Wilson Center Brazil Institute, in whose name I welcome you all here to the center. Ready or not, in 10 days, Brazil will greet the world's most popular sports event. What was supposed to be a global coming out party of a nation in transformation has turned out to be a source of much national controversy and anxiety. A year after widespread protests and weeks ahead of the World Cup and of national elections, the Pew Research Center asked Brazilians what they think about conditions in their country. The poll, part of the Pew Research Center's annual international survey, asked Brazilians for their opinion on the directions of the country and the future of its economy, Brazil's place in the world, problems like rising prices, unemployment, crime, corruption, and pollution, national leaders and institutions, including President Dilma Rousseff and her challengers in October's election, and whether the World Cup will help or hurt the economy and the country's image. The Brazil Institute is pleased to welcome this morning Juliana Menasce Horowitz, senior researcher at the Pew Center and principal author of the survey report, which she will present shortly. Juliana's presentation will be followed by a discussion with 4 leading journalists, all experts on the topics covered in the survey. Here with us in Washington is Jeff Dyer from the Financial Times, joining from a Google Hangout in São Paulo are José Roberto de Toledo, executive editor of Estadão Dados at the daily Estado de São Paulo, Todd Benson, Reuters bureau chief in Brazil, and Fábio Zanini, the foreign editor of daily Folha de São Paulo. Brief summaries of their bios, as well as Juliana's, are available online. A special thanks to my my very dear friend, Flávia Seklis, Head of Communication and Public Affairs at Google Brazil, who welcomed our commentators at Google's offices in São Paulo. Our thanks also to Google's Mariana De Felice, who worked with our Michael Darden and Carolina Cárdenas in the preparation of this session. A special thanks to our Pew Center colleagues Russ Oates, Richard Wyke, and Bruce Stokes, with whom it is always a pleasure to collaborate. Juliana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Paulo, for hosting us again. We were here 4 years ago with a very different story about Brazil. And thank you to the Brazil Institute and to Jeff and the panelists in Brazil and to all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to what I think will be a lively discussion about what's going on and looking forward to your questions as well. So today's talk is based on the new survey that we just conducted and the report that we just released, Brazilian Discontent Ahead of the World Cup. 4 years ago, we were here with a report that said that Brazilians were upbeat about its country despite its problems. Brazilians were upbeat about their country despite its problems. And so just to give you a very quick overview about the Pew Research Center, for those of you who aren't familiar with our work, we're a nonpartisan, we call ourselves a fact tank rather than a think tank. Everything we do is based on basically solid data. We cover a wide range of issues, including our global opinion work, which the Brazil survey is part of, but also U.S. domestic politics, which is what some of you might know us for, as well as research on social trends, religion and public life, the Hispanic population in the United States, internet and technology. And so we cover a wide range of issues, and we have also surveyed 82 different countries since 2002. The survey in Brazil is part of a 45-nation project that we're doing this year, and reports have already started coming out. Data is still being collected in some of the countries. Some reports that we've done so far have been on Egypt, Ukraine, the European Union, and more will come out throughout the year. And so especially for those of you who are interested in Brazil, we'll have much more in Brazil, putting it in the context of other emerging markets and other countries around the world. And so later this summer and in the fall, look for more in Brazil. But the findings that we're going to present today are more specific to the situation in Brazil rather than trying to put it in an international and cross-national context. The survey was conducted in April, from April 10th through the 30th, with about 1,000 respondents. It is based on a nationally representative face-to-face survey, meaning that we surveyed in all 5 regions of the country, and we covered both the urban and the rural areas. The interviews were conducted face-to-face, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3.8 percentage points. So we'll start with the overall national mood in the country. And I'm sure it's not surprising to most people who've been looking at what's going on in Brazil and paying attention to what's going on in Brazil, that dissatisfaction with the way things are going in the country has just shot up in the last year. As you can see, 4 years ago, Brazilians were divided, and so the overall mood wasn't necessarily positive, but it was divided. And just to give you a little bit of context, at that time, we had surveyed in 22 countries, and Brazilians were the second most satisfied with the way things were going in their country. The Chinese were the only ones that were more satisfied than the Brazilians. But even at a time that the world was was just going through and just coming out in some places of a major financial crisis, Brazilians were so relatively happy with the way things were going. It started inching up a little bit each year. So by 2012, 56%, and last year, 55% of Brazilians were dissatisfied with the way things were going in the country. And the survey last year was conducted around the same time last year, so in April, and so just about 2 months before the protests. And so there was already dissatisfaction there. But it shot up from 55% to 72% of Brazilians this year saying they're dissatisfied with national conditions. An even more dramatic change is in opinions about the economy, because those had actually been very positive throughout the time that we've been polling in Brazil. And so you can see that 4 years ago, at the end of Lula's second term, 62% of Brazilians said the economy was in good shape. And that stayed positive, with the majority giving positive ratings to the economy until last year. And there was a very sharp drop from 59% saying the economy was good to 32% saying that, and 67% saying the Brazilian economy is in bad shape. So both for the overall national conditions and for economic ratings, these numbers are true across the board, so we didn't see any major demographic differences there. We do see some later on, and I'll point those out to you. But in terms of national conditions and views of the economy, the dissatisfaction is widespread throughout education, income, gender, age groups, and as well as rural and urban areas. There's still a fair amount of optimism that the economy will improve in the next year, but Brazilians are considerably less confident than they were a year ago. So a year ago, when Brazilians already said the economy was good, 79% thought that it would actually improve and get even better over the following year. That's gone down 16 points. But 63%, so a majority of Brazilians still say that the economy will improve in the next year. When we ask about problems in the country, 85% of Brazilians say that rising prices are a very big problem, as well as crime and healthcare, corruption, lack of job opportunities, inequality, schools, and public debt, although that's a little bit lower than some of the other items. But as you can see, there are concerns about a variety of issues, and these aren't necessarily new. A year ago, we asked about rising prices and lack of job opportunities, inequality and public debt, and those were already high, and we haven't seen a change from last year. And then 4 years ago, we had asked about crime, corruption, and some other items, and those haven't changed either. And that's why in 2010, even though Brazilians were happy with the economy, Lula was very popular, and these concerns were already there, and so these aren't necessarily new concerns for Brazilians. But with the World Cup coming up, we asked Brazilians whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for the country to be hosting the World Cup. And a majority of Brazilians, 61%, said that it's a bad thing for the country because it takes money away from important public services like healthcare and education, and that money is going towards something else, like hosting the World Cup. But 34% of Brazilians say that it's good because it'll help the economy by creating jobs. And so this is interesting, just going back to what Paulo was saying, it's, that in the country where soccer is, is like a religion, basically, and when Brazil was awarded the World Cup, there was such a national euphoria, and this was supposed to be Brazil's coming out party to the world, and 61% of Brazilians, now just ahead of the World Cup, are saying that this is a bad thing for the country in light of all the concerns that they have. But what I think is really interesting here is that even though Brazilians are united in saying that the country has a lot of problems and things aren't going well, they're divided on whether the protests that have brought attention to some of these problems has been a good thing or a bad thing. So there's no consensus that protesting about these problems that everybody sees as problems has been a good thing for Brazil. And so 47%, so about half of Brazilians, say that the protests have been good for Brazil because they brought attention to these important issues. But the other half say that these protests were bad for Brazil because it damaged Brazil's image around the world, as all these images from the protests are being broadcast and as all these issues are being aired out. What's interesting here is that there are some big demographic differences. So those who have more education tend to be more supportive of the protests. So people with at least some post-secondary education, a majority of them, 62% of them, say the protests have been good for Brazil. Those with at least some secondary education are divided. And then those who have a primary education or less tend to think the protests were bad for Brazil. And similarly, older people tend to be less supportive of the protests than younger people. We also asked about President Rousseff and some other leaders. And so one of the questions that we ask is whether the president is having a good influence or a bad influence on the way things are going in the country. And Brazilians are divided when it comes to Dilma's influence in the country. 48% say she's having a negative influence, and 52% say she's having a positive influence. When you compare this to where Lula was 4 years ago at the end of his second term, you can see just how different Brazilian views of their president is now. from what it was 4 years ago. 84% of Brazilians said Lula was having a positive influence on the way things were going at the end of his presidency. Again, there are big demographic differences here. A majority of lower income and less educated Brazilians say the president is having a good influence, whereas a vast majority of those who have more education and higher incomes say that she's having a negative influence. With Lula, the pattern was there in the sense that he also had more support from lower income and less educated people, but majorities across all groups said that he was having a good influence. We asked about specific issues and how Dilma is handling each of them. And as you can see, she gets extremely overwhelmingly negative ratings for her handling of some very important issues in Brazil. Right now, 86% say they disapprove of the way she's handling corruption, 85% crime, healthcare, and again, majorities across the board and all different demographic groups, even the ones that say that overall her influence is positive, also give her negative ratings for the specific issues. But Bolsa Familia, which is a program that Lula started, is an anti-poverty program, and it's a program that Dilma has been very supportive of and has strengthened, is still a very popular program. Not surprisingly, it's more popular among those who benefit from it the most, so the less educated and lower income, but it does get majority support across the board in Brazil. And so that's one area where the programs of her government and the PT's platform in general still gets a lot of support. We asked people about their views of Dilma and her main challengers in the election, Aécio Neves and Eduardo Campos. And as you can see here, she gets better favorable ratings than her main challengers do. But as you can see, there are a lot of people who still don't offer a rating of them. 20% didn't offer an opinion about Aécio Neves, and 29% didn't offer an opinion about Campos. And so that means that there's still a lot of room for these candidates to either get positive or negative reactions from people. We don't know which way that's going to go, and there's a long time between now and the election. But there's room there for these two other candidates to shape their image in a way that nobody said that they didn't have an opinion of the president, which is not surprising since she's obviously a very public figure. But then we also asked about some other people who are not running for president, and I included Dilma's rating on here just for context. And as you can see, Lula is so extremely popular. 66% of Brazilians still have a favorable opinion of him, whereas Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who's the president before Lula, gets overwhelmingly negative ratings. Joaquim Barbosa, who just retired as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, also very popular in Brazil. 60% have a positive rating of him. Marina Silva, who's running as Eduardo Campos' vice presidential candidate, is as popular as Dilma is right now, but as you can also see, there are about 13 or 15% of Brazilians who don't currently have an opinion of her, and again, as she becomes better known, she's more well known than than the main presidential candidates, in part because she ran in the last election, and she's been a very public figure. But right now, she gets more favorable ratings than Campos does. And again, I just left Dilma on here just so you can see her in context with some of the other important leaders in Brazil. In addition to asking about people, we also asked about ratings of groups and institutions, and this is a question that we ask from time to time, not just in Brazil, but in other countries. The last time that we asked it in Brazil was in 2010, and as you can see, the dissatisfaction is not just with the president and not just with the economy or the overall situation in the country, but some important institutions in the country have also become considerably less popular. So the police, which were already among the least popular institutions 4 years ago. Back then, about half of Brazilians said that the police were having a good influence on the way things were going in the country, and that's dropped to 33%. There have been some very public reports of excessive use by police during protests and in other instances as well, and so that's been highly publicized in the past few months, and that's reflected in our findings. Ratings for the military have also declined. 66% 4 years ago said the military was having a positive impact on the country, and now about half say that's the case. And the media still remains popular. 69% say they're having a good influence, but considerably fewer people say that than said so 4 years ago. So only religious leaders remain as popular as they have been. And so as you can see, this negative mood is generalized. It's not just, it's not just concentrated on one person or one party or one specific realm of Brazilian politics. And then finally, we want to talk about Brazil's place in the world, because that's been a very important part of the Brazil story in the last few years. How it's been about Brazil's rise, and hosting the World Cup was, like we said, was supposed to be this coming out party for Brazil. The whole world will be watching, and this was Brazil's chance to basically showcase to the world what Brazil can do. And so 4 years ago, we asked Brazilians if Brazil already was or would eventually become one of the most powerful nations in the world. And back then, 77% of Brazilians, if you combine the will eventually be or is already, if you combine those two numbers, 77% of Brazilians were confident that Brazil was, on its way to becoming one of the most powerful nations. And that's declined to 59%. So still a majority saying that, but we have 37%, which is not a small minority, it's a substantive minority, now being very skeptical, saying now we'll never be one of the world's leading powers, while 59% say that is going to happen or has already happened. And Brazilians think their country should be more respected than it is. Despite its problems, 76% of Brazilians say that, we're not getting the respect that we deserve and we should be more respected. And 21% say that Brazil is as respected as it should be. But even though Brazilians are united again in saying that the country should be more respected abroad, there's no consensus as to whether hosting the World Cup will lead to that. The idea that the World Cup was the chance for Brazil to really show to the world what it can do, and that it really is one of the leading nations and up to the same standards as some of the most powerful countries. Now 35% of Brazilians say that hosting the World Cup will help Brazil's image, and about the same number, 39% say that it will actually hurt Brazil's image abroad, and then 23% say that hosting the World Cup will not have an impact. And so those were the findings that I wanted to run through, and I'll turn it over back to Paulo.
Well, thank you, Juliana, very much. So let me describe to you how we are going to proceed here as the guy in charge of the midfield here. So we are going to hear from the four discussants now. Initial brief comments from all of them, starting with Jeff here. Then we'll have a conversation between them and Juliana. Then we'll open for conversation with you all. I just ask you to keep the ball within the four, lines of this game, and on this topic, and obviously every question that come to mind related to this wonderful survey. Jeff.
Thank you very much. First of all, Paulo, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Juliana, for the presentation, and it's so nice to be here with so many old friends. As the discussion carries on, we can talk about how this survey intersects with what we're going to see with the World Cup. But before then, just to sort of get discussion going, I want to just highlight three basic points, things that really struck me from this very interesting poll data. The first was Juliana's first slide, the level of dissatisfaction in Brazil at the moment, that figure of 72%, I think it was. That strikes me as an extraordinarily bad number for an incumbent politician to have. American pollsters ask slightly different questions. They ask people the question, is the country on the right track? Which is perhaps a slightly different way of framing it. But to give you some kind of parameter, when Barack Obama was re-elected a couple of years ago, the figure was 55% of the American population thought the country wasn't on the right track. And during the campaign, at various times, that number got up towards 60%, and the White House entered into absolute panic when it got towards 60%. So that's just to give you some kind of idea. That strikes me as an incredibly negative number for the for the Brazilian government. And so that leads me almost to ask a question, in a sense, which I'd be interested to see if the colleagues in São Paulo have any thoughts on. Perhaps this is maybe just a slightly emotional reaction, a temporary reaction. There's a lot of, the mood is very bad in Brazil at the moment, lots of bad stories about airports and stadiums and all the rest of it. And maybe this is something that will just pass. But maybe this tells us that actually President Dilma is extremely vulnerable, and much more vulnerable than perhaps we've come to think. The second thing that really caught my attention was the list of problems and people's sense of what the biggest problems are. And that was very interesting to me because all the protests last year and a lot of the unhappiness that people expressed in the recent months really focused on things like healthcare and education and public services and the whole idea of padrão FIFA. But actually, the top problem was inflation. And again, that's sort of politics 101 in Brazil. But you get into trouble as an incumbent when inflation starts to rise. And even with all these other issues that have got a lot of attention, sure enough, inflation's there back at the top. Again, another potentially very bad sign for President Dilma. And then the final thing I thought was very interesting were Juliana's comments about demographics. The whole series of charts she presented showing that President Dilma's popularity is very much based in some of the sort of amongst less educated Brazilians, especially compared to President Lula. And there's a certain irony there, in as much as President Lula's particular political skill was his ability to appeal to less educated Brazilians, to talk directly to them. And yet he enjoyed popularity across social classes in Brazil. President Dilma has always been sold as a technocrat, someone who can get things done, and yet her popularity, by surprisingly, is actually concentrated in less educated Brazilians. That also seems to me to be something to pay very close attention to. It's not anything to suggest that Brazil is going to become Venezuela, but it does suggest that the tone of Brazilian politics might start to coarsen, might start to become much harsher, particularly in this election campaign. I think that's something to keep an eye on. So that's just 3 very quick reactions, hopefully just to get some conversation going.
Thank you, Jeff. We are now going to turn to São Paulo. I would like to invite José Alberto de Toledo to start. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Do you listen? Okay.
Go ahead, José Alberto.
Okay. Well, it's always a good thing when you see many different polls go in the same direction. And the results that we are reading today are pretty much the same that we've been seeing in the last years. Surveys, for example, from Datafolha, from Ibope, and it shows a change in the mood of Brazilian public opinion towards change. People, it's not a specific question in this particular survey, but the mood is for change. And this is the main drive of this election. But it's always good to take a step back and see things in the long run. And I think this is the best thing that this study does, because we need to see to look things in a bigger picture, in a long time perspective. So, because we are comparing 2013 before the protests with today, and things have been changing during this time period. We've been seeing this step by step, but when you see this 1 year from another, comparing 1 year to another, of course, it seems like the changes have been in a much more dramatic way. So the thing is how this will impact the results in the coming elections. And I think that maybe for the first time in Brazilian history, the World Cup can have a part in this play, because not because necessarily how the Brazilian team, national team, will succeed or not, but how we as hosts will conduct the World Cup. which will be the image that Brazil will project as host of the World Cup. I think this is one of the main things about the World Cup and the elections. And of course, the economy, as Geoff already has said, is the main thing in any Brazilian election. And I suspect that everything that we are seeing has a background in the economy. If the economy wasn't going so bad and wasn't pointing in the wrong direction, I would doubt that the mood in the country would be the same as it is today. So I think the study it's very important for this, for us to take a step back and look for the things in the long time perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Toledo. Todd, could you?
Hi.
Your reaction.
Thank you very much also for the invitation. Yeah, I would agree with Toledo in that just as a starting point that this survey truly does reflect the mood here. For all of us who are in Brazil, I mean, it paints a portrait of a very gloomy Brazil, and that is certainly the mood. I have been in Brazil for 15 years, and without a doubt, this is the worst I have felt it since I've been here. It is extremely vivid being here in the country. You feel it. And if I had to sum it up in maybe one sentence, I think it would be this: that Brazilians are just tired of being told that they've never had it so good. And I think for the last decade, that is all they have heard from Lula and from Dilma, is that, you know, things have never gone so well, and they should be happy with that. And you know, obviously the reality is not quite that. And as this poll shows, Brazilians have really woken up to that, which we all saw graphically last year with the protests. That said, there were a few small surprises in this poll for me. One, I would say, was the item about the concerns about job opportunities. And I say that because, you know, over the past year in particular, the low unemployment rate in Brazil has been flagged by the government as the good news story, that unemployment is near a record low. But there's also a separate data item that the government puts out every month, which is job creation, formal job creation. And that number has been continually worsening for the last year and a half. That, I think, is a real warning sign that is a concern, because it shows that the broad economic malaise that financial markets and investors have been talking about regarding Brazil over the last couple of years is starting to trickle down to the population, and the population is waking up to that. So I think that is a red flag for any any strategist working for the incumbent. That said, I also thought it was really telling and a little bit of a surprise that 63% still think the economy will improve over the next year. I mean, for me, that was kind of the classic Brazilian optimism showing through despite the bad mood in the country. I would also say that maybe there is a little bit of a silver lining in this poll for Dilma, in that sure, she gets very poor marks all across the board, and there are a lot of reasons for her to worry before this election. But I think that, the numbers about the opposition, and we've seen that in other polls about the opposition candidates, just seem to show that there is Dilma has the good luck of facing a toothless opposition right now. So, one of the big surprising stories about Brazil, and a lot can still happen between now and the election, obviously, but one of the big surprising things is that an incumbent with such poor marks is still a strong favorite at this stage in the game. In lots of other countries, I don't think you would see that. And then finally, a few other small observations. I thought it was surprising that the level of support for protests was not higher among the demographic of 18 to 29-year-olds. It was just 52 to 43%, from 43%. That surprised me. I thought that in that age group it would be higher. I think that's interesting because it shows that there is a fatigue with the protests in Brazil. that has set in. We'll see how that pans out during the World Cup. And then finally, it also surprised me that on the list of major problems in the country, that public transportation was so low, given that it figured so prominently in last year's protests. And for all of us who live in these major Brazilian cities, it is such a vivid problem for everybody. I was really surprised that was that low on the list. So those are just a few observations from me, from my perspective, to get us started as well.
Okay, Todd, thank you very much. Now, Fabio, please give us your reactions to the survey.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me for this discussion. Very interesting survey that you've conducted. And I would say that the main results are at the same time shocking, but not surprising, even though it seems a bit paradoxical. It is not surprising because we've been following the change in the mood of the Brazilian population for the last year. So we know people are angry and people are worried and not as optimistic as a Brazilian normally is. But at the same time, when you look at the numbers and the negative numbers, especially concerning Dilma and her government, it is still shocking. The depth of the resentment in the population, it is still shocking. I think also the perceptions concerning the World Cup are maybe the most remarkable and most striking thing. One of the most remarkable things of this survey, even though I think the perceptions about the World Cup, they will probably change a bit when the tournament starts. And obviously, it will depend on how far Brazil progresses. It will be a tragedy for Dilma if Brazil loses in the last 16, as some people are fearing or expecting here. But I think perceptions concerning the World Cup, they will still change a little bit, even though it's still very, very shocking for me. If you look at the numbers, I think the first thing you think is how can Dilma be reelected with such numbers and with such data? One could get the impression that the opposition should start putting champagne on ice and start planning for the victory party in Avenida Paulista or Copacabana Beach. When I think the reality is much more subtle than that. Dilma is, in my view, still the strong favorite, and I will tell you why. I think it's the notion that some people had until a few months ago that the election would be a mere formality or would be a walk in the park for Dilma. I think that's not true anymore, and no one expects it to be like that. But still, Dilma is the favorite, and it is still her election to lose. Unemployment is still low, even though it is also surprising that so many people are concerned about job opportunities in the future. Unemployment is still low for Brazilian standards. Inflation, it's not exactly low, but it is under control, even though more and more people are concerned about it. But you don't see an explosion in inflation. No one is foreseeing that inflation will get out of hand. She's got the best campaign team. She's got the best campaign communications director in the João Santana is considered the best in the field. She's got the biggest share on TV. She's got support of powerful local bosses. She's got popular projects that she will sell in the campaign, like Mais Médicos, which is her health initiative, Minha Casa Minha Vida, her housing project. And you still have 63% of Brazilians that expect the economy to improve in the near future. So there is still some optimism there. And also as important, people still don't see the opposition as an alternative. They don't see Aécio Neves, they don't see Eduardo Campos as a real, true alternative. A lot, it's true, because they are not as well known as Dilma is, but they have not presented themselves at this moment as a credible alternative. Obviously, there's a campaign coming in August. TV campaign will start. So Aécio Neves and Campos will have the opportunity to present themselves as an alternative. And we know from past experience that in Brazil, when the TV starts in August, things do change, and things can change. And the campaign really starts in August. So we're just warming up at this moment.
Okay.
But I think just to conclude, that Dilma will have all the tools in her hands to still be reelected, and she will be, and she's already doing it. She will be she'll try to play it safe in her campaign. She will run a bit of a campaign based on fear, on let's keep what we have instead of going to the uncertainty of the opposition. It's very interesting that in 2002, when Lula was elected, he famously said that hope beat fear. I think Dilma now wants, that fear beat hope. That's her. She'll run a bit on this campaign.
Thank you, Fabio. Well, let's organize this in this way. Let's keep discussions about campaign elections for a little bit later on, and now focus on the issues raised by the survey. One thing, starting with this indication that inflation, that has always been a key element in electoral politics in Brazil, Brazilians will no longer put up with inflation. Actually, if you read Dilma's inaugural address, she states that and says that we will do the utmost and we will not allow inflation to come back and hunt us. So with that in mind, I would like to ask for Juliana's reactions, but trying to focus initially on those issues that were highlighted by the discussants, starting with this idea, because it's important for one reason. According to news just released in Brazil, it was commented earlier this week, the Brazilian economy grew at a very, very weak pace in the first quarter, and may be right now in recession. So this is a very relevant thing, because once the soccer we are done with soccer, people go back to reality, and reality, regardless of the outcome, will be what it is. So I ask Juliana, your reaction to the comments, keeping this economic background in mind.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I wanted to point out that I thought was really interesting, that I think everybody touched on, but Toledo in particular made the connection between the current overall mood and views of the economy, as well as concerns about inflation and concerns about other economic issues. And I wish I had the slides side by side, but if you have the report in front of you on page 3, we do show the slide that's up right now and the one that I'm about to show you. But what you can see is that even from 2010 through 2013, ratings of the economy were not pegged, or ratings of the overall direction of the country were not pegged to what was going on in the economy. So even though people have very positive views of the economy, I'm going to go back and forth a little bit, so I apologize for that, but the country satisfaction has always been, there's always been more dissatisfaction with the overall direction of the country than there had been with the economy, whereas now the two are tracking each other. So I do think that there is some validity to the fact that as Brazilians have become more concerned with the economy, and the economy is not growing at the same rate that it had been, that now that you have those two things, the overall concerns with other problems like crime and corruption that have always been there, with a concern about the economy, that those things now going in the same direction contributes very much to this overall negative mood, which I thought was a good observation there. I did want to say, because I got this question yesterday about public transportation, and I don't think I have that in the slide, because I didn't want to show all the issues because it creates a very cramped slide to read. But so 48% of Brazilians said that public transportation was a very big problem, which, we all know that public transportation and the rise in the bus fares last year was sort of set off this protest in São Paulo, and then it spread to other issues. But I do think that part of what might be going on here is that maybe people associate concerns with public transportation more with their local and state governments, and maybe if they're thinking about overall like big national problems. And it's not that people don't think public transportation is a problem in Brazil, but that when they're thinking about big national problems, that maybe they're not thinking as much about public transportation. And so that would be my my reaction to that, because I agree that public transportation is very much something that Brazilians are concerned about.
Now, one thing I wanted to then ask the discussants to come back and comment, but one thing, I'm just back from Brazil. Actually, I was there twice last month, first in São Paulo, then in Brasilia. And one thing that caught my attention is the fact that, maybe reflecting this mood, the sour mood in Brazil, that you don't see as many flags, as many streets being painted. And I wanted to ask, especially those who are there in Brazil, is just because people didn't start yet, and this will come this weekend, which is the last weekend before the kickoff, or is this something really different? I don't know if one of you in São Paulo would like to comment on that, and also react to Juliana's. Yeah.
What I can say, Paulo, is that the flags started to be sold yesterday. Yeah, well, I think we have here what the pollsters call a circle of silence. People are not saying that the World Cup will succeed or everything is going to be a success because they are afraid of saying so. It's like the voters for Paulo Maluf. They never say they will vote for him. But when the election comes, he's always elected with a very high number of votes. So I think we have almost the same situation now. It's politically incorrect to say you are in favor of the World Cup because you are automatically being seen as a supporter of the government. And there are many people who don't want to be as viewed as that. So, but I really believe that this is change already has starting to change the mood in the streets, I think. But we will have probably the right answer for that in the first game of the World Cup. Of course, there will be protests, but I think that will be our thermometer, will be the main indicator.
Let me try Todd and Five on this, because I was describing a situation I saw in Brasilia, I saw in São Paulo, but I was not in the so-called popular neighborhoods. I was in Pinheiros, I was in the Plano Piloto, I was in the high-income people.
You are in PSDB country.
Yeah, in PSDB country. Now, when you go to, do you see there when you go to the so-called periferia, to the popular neighborhoods, do you see a different disposition regarding the World Cup?
Yeah, I can try to answer that and give a sneak preview of what we're doing at Reuters. In fact, we're writing a story about that, which should probably come out either tomorrow or the next day. But yes, we've had a few reporters in São Paulo and in Rio go out to the outskirts, to the periferia, to see. And if you compare it to, I've been here for 3 World Cups, 2002, 2006, 2010, and yes, at this stage, we are not seeing, at least where we've gone, as much World Cup excitement, painting the streets, painting the sidewalks, even in the periferia. But I think, like Toledo said, I think that is now starting to change. Suddenly, there's a little bit of a last-minute rush. Like, okay, this World Cup really is going to happen. No one's going to stop it. So, let's enjoy it. I think there is a little bit of that going on, but overall, it is indeed politically incorrect. I mean, it's almost as if many Brazilians are embarrassed to admit that they are going to have fun and enjoy this World Cup.
Well, I confess that I thought I confess that I bought 15 shirts the other day, and they will be in Montana, in Colorado, and Idaho. So, you know, and being politically very incorrect. So,
Paulo, may I just add something? I think a major problem with the World Cup is that it's very related to corruption. People associate the World Cup, especially those huge stadiums, with corruption because budgets were blown up, and there are many suspicions of that funds were diverted, etc. And as we see in the survey, it is also another surprise for me that the biggest problem concerning Dilma, when you list the areas where she has performed or underperformed, is corruption. 86% have a very negative image of Dilma in fighting corruption. I think it's top of the list, and it is quite surprising that because when she came to office in 2011, her first big move was the so-called faxina, the cleanup of the ministries, because many ministers that were associated with Lula, Lula had a very strong tendency to keep these ministers and to defend these ministers, even though there were lots of accusations against them. And Dilma started by doing it differently and firing many ministers, and she made some political capital out of it. And she was seen as the president of the faxina. So 3 years down the road, we see that it has gone away. This image has gone away, and the issue of corruption, which is closely associated with the World Cup, maybe it helps explain why Brazilians are so embarrassed to say that they are expecting the World Cup, and yes, they want Brazil to win a sixth trophy.
They also may be associated with another major headline scandal that we had in Brazil recently involving Petrobras. I don't know if you guys... Was that, Jeff? Do you think that there is a relationship? Because it's quite surprising that Dilma, that was seen, and I assume is still seen as an honest politician, being seen in the light that is described by the survey.
Oh, absolutely. That's what that is. In some sense, one of the most surprising things is that the way she comes up so badly on issues like corruption, where she has at least appeared to have tried to do a lot more than her predecessors, and something she'd made such a big play on. But the thing that strikes me is I can't obviously comment about the mood in Brazil at the moment, but I can sort of put in context of how these big events play out in lots of other countries. And there's very much an arc to the way the media cover these events. I mean, in the month running up to these events, we're always incredibly negative. We're always very pissy. There's always something that we focus on. And usually it's a very real thing. I mean, if you think about the Sochi Olympics a few months ago, all those stories about bad hotel rooms, and remember all those his and hers toilets looking at each other, remember all those stories? I mean, we were obsessed about that. And the London Olympics, London was in incredibly grumpy mood, and the month before the Olympics it was very expensive and security was a mess. But as soon as it starts, we roll over, as long as it looks good. Never, and I can say this, you can't, Paolo, but never underestimate the superficiality of the media. As long as, if it looks good, then if it plays well on TV, then quite quickly this kind of mood of pessimism can really disappear. I mean, it's pure bread and circuses. I mean, I was in Beijing for the Olympics there, and the Chinese government were doing things that at any other time would be a huge scandal. They were arresting people left, right, and center, and throwing people from different ethnic groups out of Beijing just because they happen to be from ethnic groups. They're doing things that were just a massive scandal. You could not get anyone interested in those things during the games because they just looked fantastic. So as long as it looks well on TV, it's quite possible that some of this mood will dissipate quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
May I say just
yes.
one thing? Here, what Fabio, Todd, and Geoff said occurred to me that this is an interesting thing because it's a festival where the bills comes first. First you pay, then you go to the party. So I think that's what's happening. We are paying before we have the joy to join the party.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting observation. Let me try something else here. I wanted to hear your opinion about this, because I find something, reading a statement that Roberto da Mata, the anthropologist, made to a piece that appeared this weekend in São Paulo, is that there is a silver lining in the sense that the country of soccer is no longer only the country of soccer. It's a country where there is a rising middle class. There is a citizenry engaged in discussing matters of public interest. And a lot of this grumpiness reflects sort of a kind of maturity that I personally welcome very much, because I see Brazil much more as the country of Embraer than the country of soccer. Let's see, maybe the World Cup will prove me wrong. I hope so. But I wanted to have your reaction on that. Do you see something under all this grumpiness? There is something that may be turned into a more positive, hopeful narrative?
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you. I actually think this is this kind of pressure that the public is trying to put on the government is a fundamentally very good thing for Brazil. And actually, it wouldn't be at all a bad thing for Brazil if there are lots of protests during the World Cup, which would make Brazil very much an outlier from all those other cases I was talking about. And it is quite possible there will be, street protests during the World Cup, which would make Brazil very different. But I think, although that's not the image the Brazilian government wants to sell the world, I think that would be a fantastically powerful thing for Brazil, because it's not about this government of this day, it's about society putting pressure on a political elite from all different parties, where there is, despite the fact that Brazil's had a very successful 20 years, there still is a huge sense of complacency amongst the political elite about certain types of issues, about infrastructure, about public services. And this is really kind of a kick that society, the political elite, very much needs. And I also think it's not so bad for the world as well if this happens, if there is a big protest movement at the same time as the tournament's going on. I mean, if you think about the FIFA and the International Olympic Committee, I mean, with the possible exception of the Chinese Communist Party, these are the two most unaccountable and self-regarding organizations on the entire planet, right? I mean, they are pumped up with conceit and arrogance. And the fact that they might get a little bit of a kicking as well is maybe not the worst thing that can happen from this event too. And will give a greater sense of realism. I mean, both of these organizations have, each time they hold these events, they've pushed more and more demands on the country, and they want it to look better and better. And there needs to be more modesty about these events. They can be done much more cheaply and with much more humility. You don't need to have everything brand new spanking stadiums or all these things. Things can be done in a slightly cheaper and more realistic manner.
Well, one point that I wanted to make was, Paulo, you mentioned this emerging middle class, and I think that's an interesting point, and that's something that we've been looking at, not just in Brazil, but in other countries, and something that we hope to continue to look at in more depth in the coming months and actually really coming years. And because it's something, it's a phenomenon that's been documented in political science, for decades, that, as more people move into the middle class, that and they sort of go beyond the economic concerns, that they become more concerned with things like corruption or, civil liberties and civil rights and things that, if you're focused on survival, you can't necessarily focus on. But what I think is really interesting with the results of our survey is that in Brazil, even though, and we saw with the protests that there was a lot on gay rights and corruption and things that moved beyond economic concerns, but what we see is that the economic concerns are still there. And so these protests and this mood in Brazil is not just people moving beyond these economic issues, but the economic issues are very much still present there. But those are definitely things that we'll be looking at.
Now, Toledo and Todd and Fabio, Jeff here and Juliana, help me with something that I find fascinating. Last year, everything wanted everything FIFA standard in Brazil. FIFA meaning first world. Suddenly we turned against FIFA because of the perception of corruption. 2 weeks ago, President Dilma Rousseff received a group of sports writers in Brasilia and complained about FIFA's heavy-handedness. That is, they're too heavy. They are creating what I found very interesting, which is hedging a bit, creating some distancing herself from what she called the Copa das Copas. So, how is this dance evolving, particularly in light of something that really surprised me, that the government has, I think, this past week, launched a television campaign to defend the World Cup in Brazil, which I think I compare with friends to the mayor of Assisi, Italy, launching a campaign to defend St. Francis. I don't think it would be normally be necessary because this is our religion, as Jeff mentioned. So, give me your reaction to that.
You know better than me that in Brazil, São Francisco de Assis needs a campaign because here he's a synonym to corruption. Because it's toma lá da cá.
Toledo, let me just contextualize that. There is a famous congressman that once took a part of San Francis prayer, which is in giving that you receive, to explain the give and take of Brazilian politics. That's what he's referring to.
Let me just make 2 points on that. I mean, I think the fact that the government has launched this PR campaign to defend the World Cup is a sign of the times, right? It's who would have expected a few years ago that as a government you would have to go on the airwaves and convince the population that, hey, this is actually worth it. It's almost embarrassing. I mean, I feel you know, what, as Brazilians say, the vergonha alheia, right? You know, you can just feel embarrassed for them having to go on national television.
This is Argentina. They invented it.
But, you know, and go out, you know, go out publicly and criticize, for example, Ronaldo, who said he felt embarrassed by you know, some of the preparations for the World Cup. I mean, it has gotten kind of ugly, right? It's an ugly spectacle. You know, that spectacle, as Jeff rightly pointed out, will suddenly shift when the games start, probably. But it's quite shocking, right? And then I just wanted to follow up on the previous discussion quickly on the other point about, you know, Brazilian society waking up, no longer being just the country of soccer. Just to maybe voice add a little voice of skepticism to that debate, and it could be that I've been contaminated by the pessimism of the national mood here, but I still think it really remains to be seen if that is going to yield much in terms of results over time. I think politically, we've all seen here how difficult it is politically to get through broad economic reforms that lead, you know, that create the conditions for faster and more sustained economic growth. It is very difficult. Tax reform in Brazil, it's, you know, for 15 years I've heard it over and over and seen hardly anything been able to be achieved on that. So I'm a skeptic on whether or not that will yield to, you know, sustained positive change. I think it's going to take a lot longer than most of us would hope for on that point.
Paulo, can I just add something about the FIFA and the World Cup? I think one central point here is who owns the World Cup? I think Brazil was a bit naive in the past and made a major mistake in thinking that Brazil owned the World Cup, that the World Cup was a Brazilian affair, when it's not. It's FIFA's show. It's called the FIFA World Cup. It's the country is only the host country. The tournament is the biggest source of income for FIFA. Every 4 years, FIFA makes millions or billions of dollars on this event, and that pays all FIFA's bills for the following 4 years, and it's no exaggeration. So it is FIFA's show. FIFA sets the rules, and FIFA asks or orders for changes in the law. For example, for allowing the consumption of beer in stadiums. In Brazil, drinking alcoholic beverages in stadiums is forbidden, but during the World Cup it will be allowed. It's just one example. So I think the government realized only very late in the game that the whole event was escaping its control. And now you see statements such as Dilma's that you mentioned, that she can't stand Sepp Blatter and Jerome Volk on her back anymore. They are too heavy, too burdensome. So I think the whole issue here is that for FIFA, they come, they organize the event, they make their money, they leave. For Brazil, the white elephant stadiums will stay. Those empty, very expensive stadiums will continue in places like Brasilia, Natal, and others. So I think that's part of the problem, and it explains a little bit why the government is a bit desperate to try to make something of this World Cup.
Okay, on that point, I wanted to ask all of you about something that may be part of the explanation of the bad mood. In FIFA, for all its sins, had initially asked Brazil to prepare 8 stadiums. And I believe it was President Lula who, with an approval rating of 86% in 87 and in 2007, 2008, 2009, decided that we should go for 12, including building or refurbishing stadiums where we have no really good league of soccer. Is that part also of the complaint? Have we stayed with, have we not overreached in that sense? You think that things would be seen a little bit better now? The public perception would have been a bit better, or wouldn't make much of a difference?
It's difficult to believe in Joseph Blatter, don't you think?
Sorry?
It's difficult to believe in Joseph Blatter.
Yes.
And this is the only source of this information. So I don't know if we can believe in his words, especially because they weren't said directly to. It was kind of a leak. But if you allow me, Paulo, I would ask 2 questions to Juliana about the pool. First of all, is it possible to compare Brazil? How does Brazil compare to other countries? Are there any questions that are comparable between Brazil and other countries? This is the first. The second one, the kind of questions that this survey does, in a way, forces the interview to give a yes or no question, and you usually don't have a middle ground. And Brazilians are famous for, if you have a wall and it's possible to be in the top of the wall, many of us will be there. So how can be an influence in those numbers, especially those very high numbers? Sometimes it seems to me that you are forcing an opinion to the people, even when they really don't have it.
So starting with your first question, we're still in the field in a lot of the countries that we're doing for the 2014 cycle of the survey, but yes, there are a lot of questions on here, and then questions that we haven't released in this report because they are more relevant and more interesting in the cross-national context. And so we kept this report focused on the questions that were relevant to the current situation in Brazil. But yes, there will be a lot of questions once all the data comes in and we start putting out our cross-national reports, including on, the image of the United States in Brazil, which I think will be an interesting one in light of Snowden and some other issues. And so I think, we'll be coming out with a series of reports that will put Brazil in a cross-national context, which we have done in the past. And, going back to all our surveys, and that was by the time we had our Brazil report in 2010, we had already collected all the data in all the countries. And so we were able to see that only the Chinese were more satisfied with the way things were going in their country and were more positive about their economy. And so compared to other countries until very recently, especially because Brazil did weather the world financial crisis considerably better than many other countries, that in a cross-national context, that Brazilians have been pretty positive compared to other countries, but we don't currently have all the data available from the other 44 countries that we're surveying this year. As far as the questions go, You know, a lot of our questions, you know, there is not necessarily a middle category, but you know, for example, the question about national problems, we ask whether it's a very big problem, a moderately big problem, you know, a small problem, or not a problem at all. And the numbers that I showed you are just the percentage that says very big problem. And so people, if they wanted to, they could hedge and they could say, well, it's sort of a little bit, you know, and so these questions aren't just, you know, yes or no. They do have gradations, and so people can offer opinions that aren't necessarily one extreme or the other.
Well, thank you. With that, I think that it's time to open up the conversation to those here that are with us, and we have a full room here. I would like to recognize first Teresa Terminacion. Teresa, wait for the microphone so the people in São Paulo can hear your question. Thank you.
Well, it's a very brief question. Has there been any official reaction to the findings of your survey?
Well, so we just launched the report. Like the findings were not available except for the embargoed copy. They were not available until 10 a.m. today, and so we do expect. You know, Paulo had mentioned that there's.
Yeah, President Dilma.
Today,
Yeah,
and so there might
President
be some
Dilma
reaction.
is hosting a dinner with some foreign correspondents tonight in, I think, Alvorada, and just wait for a few hours and you will have it. John, yes, please.
Yeah, John Garrison from the World Bank. My question is, I would like the predictions of the journalists about who they think will win the World Cup. But more seriously, do you think if Brazil does really badly, will this have a political impact on the election or not?
That's a good question.
I could have a first try at that if that's okay.
I'm writing this down, Jeff.
I'm terrible at predicting winners of World Cups. So you know, maybe as a naysayer, I fear we might see another tragedy on Brazilian soil, and maybe Argentina wins this one. But in terms of the impact of a loss by Brazil, I think
Todd,
Welcome here anymore.
Todd, you just provoked a very adverse reaction here in this one. And let me remind you, I was 2 months old when Brazil lost to Uruguay in Maracanã. I'm still traumatized, so never repeat that. Okay.
well, that is why I referred to it as another national tragedy.
Okay, go ahead, Todd.
But in terms of you know, the impact, say if Brazil gets knocked out early. But in addition to that, I also think not just, you know, the performance on the field. I think the performance off the field could have an impact on the election, on whether or not things go well or turn out ugly. I think all it could take is some protests turning violent, police reaction turning violent, and things getting ugly. I think from a political perspective, this World Cup really is a minefield for President Rousseff. A lot could go wrong. Like Toledo said early on, I think, you know, this may be the first World Cup that could end up influencing the election. You know, we did a story a few weeks ago recounting the recent history of World Cups that coincided with election years starting in 1994, and there are, you know, really no discernible impact. But I think this year there is the potential for that. So I have no doubt that they are worried about that in Brasilia.
Now, before you continue, Fabio, just one thing. But the World Cup is happening in 12 places, where in all capitals, where there will be elections for governor, and public safety is the primary responsibility of governors in Brazil. So isn't this sort of the impact to be a little bit dispersed, the political impact, or no, it's really, we are the famous centralized country where we believe that everything can be resolved in Brasilia?
Well, it's true that you know, governors could also be held accountable, but I think if you just look back at the protests last June, the sources in the government, in the federal government, were telling us when this was happening, you know, the police, they're not our responsibility. Their reaction to this is going to impact Alckmin in São Paulo, for example. As it happens, the first polls that came out a month after the protest showed that Dilma's ratings had just plummeted. So I think the federal government will not be immune to this at all. So I think that kind of showed that. So even though state governments will also be affected by it.
Yeah, and Fabio,
I tend to agree with that. I think we in Brazil tend to blame everything on the government, on the federal government, including weather and etc. So I think if there is a huge embarrassment in terms of organization, yeah, Dilma will suffer, I think, because Brazilians are very concerned about their image in the world, as this poll just showed. We pay a lot of attention. I would, in my opinion, too much attention to what people say about us in the world. So if it's an international embarrassment, yes, Dilma will suffer. As for performance on the field, I think the impact of a Brazil win or Brazil loss will be zero on the election. I don't see any correlation at all, and I'm sure Brazil will win. Answering your first question.
Okay, Elsa.
I have no idea who will win the World Cup, and that's a good thing about to be a political analyst. And but I really agree with them. It's a matter of the organization. It's not a matter of the results of the competition. Of course, if Brazil loses in the first phase, God helps, it doesn't. It may contribute to the mood will be even worse than it is today. But I think this will pass. We are not really that fanatic about football, I think. But
See, my theory
I wasn't born in 1950, so well. I would like to point another thing that it's difficult to look now, but as the survey shows, Lula has still a very powerful drive in this election. He will be again at the side of Dilma, saying, well, look, she is trying to do her best, I'm on her side. And it's going to be very interesting to see if his power to influence the campaign as he had in 2010 and in 2012 is going to be the same. And this remains to be seen. I suspect that Lula will improve a couple points in Dilma after the TV campaign starts in August. I think he will be the real candidate, not the name in the ticket, but he will try to be the one to be judged. And they will force the comparison between him and between Fernando Henrique. And we'll say, well, Dilma represents me, Aécio represents Fernando Henrique. Who will you choose? And this is going to be a very tricky question for the voters.
So, Toledo, this and everybody. So it is an election campaign about the past, not about the future. Or am I?
It's always about the past. Because in 1998, for example, the polls showed that Fernando Henrique was in an even worse situation than Dilma is today. And he was reelected because of fear. Because people look at Lula and said, well, we don't know him. We are in the middle of a crisis, an international crisis. So, I won't vote for change. Even if I want to change, I will not vote for Lula because I don't know what's going to happen with him in power. So, it's already have this same situation in the past. So it's going to be very interesting to watch if when the Workers' Party does the same as PSDB did in 1998, if it will work again as a campaign strategy.
Yes.
Paulo, can I just add something quickly,
Yes.
very quickly about Lula? I think Lula is a blessing and a curse for Dilma. Obviously, he's a very strong ally and he'll be very helpful during the campaign, but he's much more popular than Dilma today. So the talk, there's always the talk that Lula could run, could be the candidate. Every now and then, this possibility arises again. At the time, it is quiet, but I would not rule out completely that, say, we come to September or late August, and Dilma has not a very strong lead against Aécio Neves, for example, and maybe in the second round, Aécio Neves has a strong chance of winning, that Lula would replace her. Electoral laws in Brazil allow this to happen up to 20 days, if I'm not wrong, before the election. So theoretically, until early September, it could happen. But I think it's not likely at this time. But I would not rule it out completely.
Yeah, Fabio, obviously this is based on the fact that polls are suggesting that 3/4 of those that are identified with the Workers' Party would prefer Lula rather than Dilma running for the presidency. Now, President Lula himself said couple of weeks ago that when asked about if he would run instead of Dilma, he said it would be very difficult to build a narrative that would justify him running. Because obviously how you do, and I think President Lula is one of the best politicians in Brazil. For him to have said that suggests something that this could be very complicated, especially in the scenario that Fabio just described. Now let me ask Elcio Santana to ask a question here from the floor.
Yeah, quickly. First of all, Juliana, congratulations for the work. It's excellent and important work. My impression is that part of the campaign for the presidency will be played on around the discussion of who is the most efficient public manager. Aécio, Eduardo, and Dilma, they all position themselves as very efficient managers. Aécio with the choque de gestão in Minas, Eduardo with the same thing, and Dilma trying to do at the macro level. If there is a failure on the organization of the World Cup, this will have a very high price on this specific issue on the presidential campaign. So my question is, Aécio and to the panel, Aécio and Eduardo, have they been saying something about the COP and the organization of the COP? How is that discussion being taken by those two candidates?
Yeah, let me just add something. Aécio Neves and Eduardo Campos have reasonable good records as governors in Pernambuco and in Minas Gerais. And so, with that in mind, have they commented on the logistics of the World Cup, or they have stayed away from that issue?
I interviewed Eduardo Campos 3 days ago, and I asked him about the World Cup and how it will influence the elections. And of course, he's saying what's good for him. But in his point of view, if Brazil wins, Dilma has a draw. If Brazil loses, if Brazil is not a very great success, it's a draw, Dilma loses. So there's no way, in his point of view, that Dilma will profit from the World Cup. But she can really suffer if it's a failure, or even if Brazil loses the competition. I asked you yesterday, I saw him in a public speech, and he was asked about it because the polls shows that the worse is better for him. The more the situation becomes a bad thing, Aécio has a growth potential to beat Dilma, more than Eduardo Campos. So someone asked him, well, are you going to say that Argentina is going to be the favorite, as Todd did? And Menasce said, no, I will, of course, be in Brazilian side, because, of course, you can't be seen as a candidate, as someone who wants Argentina to win. You must say that you want Brazil to win, otherwise you will be out of the race. So what they say is not really what they would like to happen.
Yeah, just let me, before I turn to Jeff, one thing that, how much can they use? Remember, well, most of you guys were not born when that happened. Were you born in 1970 already? Oh, yeah, I think you were.
66.
In 1970, it was the time when the World Cup, our collective joy, was really used, abused, misused by a military dictatorship to cover up things in Brazil, including the fact that Dilma Rousseff was being tortured. I have this question because obviously it's part of, you know, my generation's history a little bit. And I sense that the candidates would be foolish to use too much this in a political way, our collective joy. I wanted to have your opinions about that. Am I being too naive here and they will use as much as they possibly can? Yes, Jeff.
I think I'd like to reinforce something Todd said earlier, that the key thing to watch out for is actually protests on the street and how they're handled. That's the really big issue. I mean, if we talk about organization of the Cup, it's kind of easy to maybe overcomplicate this. I mean, at the end of the day, it is just a football tournament, right? You know, and any given weekend in Brazil, there are big football matches in at least 10 capitals around the country. It's a very different exercise than the Olympics, which is a much more complicated thing, and you've got to spend millions of dollars on a cycling velodrome that no one ever used, and venues for taekwondo and archery and all this kind of stuff. The World Cup is still, at the end of the day, it is just a football tournament, and Brazil holds big football matches every weekend. The thing that could really is really cancerous, I think, from a political point of view, is, as Todd mentioned, if you get street protests and you get police going in and beating people up, you know, using truncheons, and that will lead the world's TV, you know, for several days if that happens. That's the thing to really keep an eye on from a political point of view, I think. I think it's much harder, really, for these kind of organizational issues, unless a stadium collapses or something like that, to really have a big political impact, I guess.
Guys, on my question, the way the candidates start with Dilma could use, for instance, a favorable outcome for Brazil.
Yeah, my view on that is I would expect the Dilma and the government to use, you know, and a positive World Cup that goes well, Brazil wins. Obviously, a huge good news story for Brazil. I would really expect them to try to exploit that shamelessly, and expect them to say, point their fingers at all the naysayers and say, you see, all you know, pessimists about Brazil. Brazil is a great country, and we get it right, and we know what to do. And when push comes to shove, you know, we know how to put on a good show. So I think, yes, I think I would not put that past them. I think that the PR campaign that they are leading right now suggests that they would do that if it all goes well.
I have my doubts, to be honest. I think if Brazil wins the World Cup, it will be Scolari's win, it will be Neymar's win, the players will be glorified, and the coach, they'll make millions, etc. They're already making millions. I think Dilma must be very careful if she tries to exploit politically a victory by Brazil. I think she might be seen as opportunistic. I think she might be seen as someone who's trying to free ride on the glory of our heroes in Maracanã Stadium. So I think, as Toledo said, the World Cup is a very delicate moment for Dilma, because she could lose a lot if many things go wrong. But if everything goes well, I don't see how she can gain politically a lot from it. So I think it will be a very interesting question to see how Dilma will try to deal with a favorable outcome from in the World Cup, and see if she will be brave enough to try to milk it.
If I was João Santana, and fortunately I'm not, well, unfortunately on the financial side, but I would say that it's impossible to profit directly from the result of the World Cup, because, as Fabio said, certainly she will be seen as someone who's trying to take advantage of someone else's effort. Exactly, but it will naturally improve the good mood among the population, and probably what João Santana is going to try to do if Brazil wins and if the World Cup is a success is to say, well, as we did a good World Cup, we can do the same with Brazil, and blah 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 and blah 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 and blah blah blah. It's a more indirect narrative. It's not a direct narrative, because Brazil knows well how football matches win, and certainly is not by the government.
Okay. Yes. As the microphone here and there, 1 and 2, please. So we have.
I'm Yu Haibin from China. As we discuss the international benefits of the World Cup, one thing come to my mind is Brazil will host the BRICS summit just after the World Cup, and also the invitation was extended to Argentina, which shows some Brazil wants to share its regional world prestige to its neighbors. As we know, China hosted the Olympic Games in 2008, and South Africa hosted the World Cup 2010. For the emerging powers, I think when hosting the mega events, will attract a lot of international attentions about its role in the world. I just want to have your insights on to what extent the membership of BRICS will be to Brazil.
Well, that's one of the questions, a little bit outside of our line on our game, but I'll ask them to react to that, because as you probably know, João Santana, that Toledo refers to, is the campaign manager for President Dilma Rousseff's re-election. As you probably know, 2 days after the final of the World Cup in the stadium of Maracanã in Rio, President Dilma will welcome in Fortaleza, in the state of Ceará, in the northeastern part of Brazil, a BRICS summit. Actually, I believe that the leaders of the BRICS are expected to attend the final game at Maracanã. And I actually have a few, I find it pretty daring politically to have scheduled things that way. And I'm curious to hear your opinion. Start with Fabio, who is the expert on this one as a foreign editor of Folha, about the BRICS. What is the impact of mixing international politics and the World Cup? And then actually the president of China will pay, I believe, a 4-day visit to Brazil in connection to all of this.
Yeah,
Fabio.
I think the BRICS summit could be a problem for Dilma. She must be very careful, because it is a very controversial BRICS summit, so to speak, because we will have Vladimir Putin here, fresh from his adventures in Ukraine, and the sight of Vladimir Putin in swimsuits, drinking coconut water on the beach in Fortaleza will be something that the press will be a glorious day for the press. And obviously we'll have Narendra Modi, the new Prime Minister from India here, also very controversial person, very controversial figure, even though he's got a very strong economic record. And then we have Xi Jinping, and then we have Jacob Zuma from South Africa. So there will be a lot of political talk on this. For example, how will Dilma deal with the Ukrainian situation? Brazil has abstained and has not commented on this issue, but with Vladimir Putin here, will Brazil be able to try to sideline this issue? Brazil, I think Dilma will try to keep it strictly economic. The BRICS summit is strictly an economic summit, and try to have something like the creation of a bank of the BRICS, etc. But I'm not sure she will be able to do that. And just posing for a photograph, just side by side with Vladimir Putin at this moment will be very tricky.
Okay. Jeff.
I think Fab's absolutely right. I mean, the BRICS group is reaching a very interesting moment. I mean, until now, the underlying ethos has been, well, why not? It's never been quite clear what the purpose of the focus is, but it made sense for each of the countries to join in, to play it up a bit. They all got certain political advantages from it. The why not was ultimately the main motivation. But the Ukraine crisis is really going to put quite a lot of pressure on BRICS, because now what you have seen is Russia and China coming together in a semi-overt, sort of anti-Western, semi-authoritarian alliance pushing back against the West. And that raises, as Fabio mentioned, some very uncomfortable questions for Brazil, for India, and for South Africa. And so this particular summit is going to be very interesting to see how they play that. It's entirely possible you might start to see some of the momentum behind BRICS start to dissipate if the Russians and the Chinese really do start to get much closer together and push this much more anti-Western type of point of view.
Yes.
Actually, I was going to ask a BRICS question, but that was already taken care of. But, I just do it. Well, I won't say that. But as an American, I have no prediction on the Cup. In our team, we've just made it from, miserable to mediocre. So we're...
No, it was the leading in your group. It was the United States was #1 in their group in the World Cup. So, miracles happen.
Yeah, you also saw what group we were in. Julia, just a question on the survey. Since 2010, or actually, there's been I would say a great but transfer of wealth to the more rural areas through agricultural exports and through the ethanol production. In your polling, did you pick up any differences, any trends that could be identified with that?
Yes, and that's an interesting question. I'm glad you brought it up, because that's I was so focused on talking about income and education and age differences that I skipped over some of the urban-rural differences. And yes, I mean, in terms of the general dissatisfaction with the country and with the economy, that's widespread both in the rural and in the urban areas. But yes, Dilma is considerably more popular in the rural areas than she is in the urban areas. And so I'm glad you brought it up, because that is something that we highlight in the report, that to the extent that there are questions where there are differences, she tends to perform better in the rural areas.
Michael, just the lady here. Yes.
Yes, Ana Araújo, FSI, and Howard University. Then I have this question for Juliana as well, following on what Paulo just commented some minutes ago. Regarding the perception of the governors of the different states, because we are focusing a lot here on Dilma in the national government, and you know that Brazilians very often, they don't know who takes care of transportation, and all this seemed to be very mixed when we had the protests last year. And I ask myself if, what is the perception of what is going to happen regarding the elections at the states level and also for the Congress, because this will also have an important impact on what is going to happen, even if Dilma, she is elected. I also have a comment regarding what José Roberto, I think, mentioned regarding the fact of seeing the elections as something that deals with the past. And when he was mentioning that the idea of fear of what can happen with the person who will be elected for president next October in Brazil. But I think that the issue here is different when you are talking about Neves and Campos, because these two politicians, they are well known. They were governors in their states. They are not politicians who are not well known in Brazil, unlike Dilma, who was a minister, but she was never elected to any elective office in Brazil before becoming president. Then I think that these are elements that we should also consider when discussing these election issues.
Okay, thank you, Anna. And I wanted to push you guys on this issue that Anna just mentioned, because it is seen, if you talk to well-informed, economists, political scientists, businessmen, and all journalists like you guys. We all know in Brazil that 2015 will be a very, very difficult year. The party will be over the account of the, expanding government, some of the what let's call it, the fiscal flexibility, will have to stop. So back to you guys in São Paulo and to the table here. None of that, all of that will be completely forgotten during the World Cup and during the election. We will just keep comparing Lula and Fernando Henrique, and that's it.
Well, of course not. We have been asking the candidates about that all the time. I personally did it 3 days ago with Eduardo Campos and with Aécio, and both say the same. Well, 2015, if I'm elected, will be better than 2014. Of course, they won't say anything different from that, because if they say, well, in fact, 2015 is going to be worse than this, well, why vote for them? So, of course, they will not say that, even if they believe it, and Dilma, most of all, won't say it neither. But of course, the discussion, we try to move on how things are going to be, what we need, what the country needs to do, and but unfortunately, in all political campaigns that I've been covering for the last 25 years, I've never seen any candidate be candid about what he's going to be when he is elected. He will say just what he needs to say to be elected.
Now, I was referring more, Toledo, to the fact that reality in Brazil, in terms of the very difficult scenario ahead, is unescapable. You cannot escape that. It's coming. We know that some of the bondades, as they are called in Brazil, will have to be reversed. Taxes will have to go up, and benefits will have to be cut. Otherwise, we are going to get ourselves into a whole lot of trouble. And that is the sense that, but it seems that you don't see the candidates sort of willing to discuss that, regardless of the World Cup outcome here. You guys there don't see that people will use this campaign to engage in the issues that will really impact on people's lives starting, well, as soon as probably the World Cup is over?
Yeah, Paulo, I think there's no question that 15 will be a difficult year. If it's Dilma, if Dilma is re-elected, or if the opposition wins, slow growth, still inflationary pressures, problems in terms of fiscal responsibility, but obviously it will not be a theme in the campaign. I think it will be people try to look at the good side of Brazilian economy, to try to look at the good side of the Brazilian spirit, etc., as campaigns normally do. One point I'd like to mention, someone I think asked about the elections for Congress. It's not only a presidential election, it's an election for the House and an election for, I think, 1/3 of the Senate. And what happens if Dilma has a strong majority there, of course, and PT, her party, is expected to do well. So what happens if Aécio Neves or Eduardo Campos wins the election? How will he govern with this Congress dominated by PT? I don't think they should be worried, because there are many parties, as PMDB, which is a center party, and some smaller parties that they just go with the flow. They just go with the government. So once Aécio Neves or Eduardo Campos is in the presidential palace, by miracle, all these parties that today support Dilma and promise to be with Dilma forever will suddenly have an awakening and come to the side of who is in charge.
Yes, there are some politicians in Brazil that in the past 60 years have never found a single government that they could oppose. So,
Thank you. My name is Todd Drakowski. I'm with the Department of State. There's a large group of diplomats who will be heading to Brazil this year. So thank you very much to the Pew Center and to the Brazil Institute for hosting us. I have a question regarding the discontent, the title of this presentation, and specifically for the panel in São Paulo. Do you find that the energy behind that discontent is ramping up? Is it waning in the days heading into the Cup? Are they, when it comes to the protests, are they all kind of placing their one big bet on disrupting things in Sao Paulo, or do you expect massive issues in all the different capitals that will be hosting the Cup? I'm curious to hear your perspective on where things stand in light of the snapshot that we saw from the Pew Research Center.
yes.
You want to give it first try?
Well, first of all, I don't see massive protests as we've seen last year. There will be protests. There will be black blocs acting very intensively, trying to make a mess. But I don't see 100,000 people in the streets protesting against the World Cup, against the government, against whatever. How will it play in the election? It's very hard to predict, because if you have a death, if you have a tragedy during the World Cup because of a protest, this can change the whole narrative. So it's very, almost everything can happen. So it's very difficult to try to predict. But I think it's almost certainly that you don't have the same mood that you had 1 year ago. At that time, if you did this research, and in fact we did, and asked how many Brazilians were supporting the protesters, there was a high of 75–80% of support for the protests. Now it's 50-50, because the protests, of course, people are in strikes, people can move through the cities, so people are feeling the consequences of the protests also. So I don't see the same kind of public mood that we had last year, this year.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think he makes an important distinction that that support for the protests has waned since last year and is very, very divided right now. And like we noted earlier in the survey, even among some of the younger demographics, which was a surprise for me. But I don't think that the broad discontent in Brazil is waning much. I think support for protest, yes, but I still think, as this poll shows, that even with the World Cup approaching, people are not happy with the general situation in Brazil, regardless of the World Cup. I think if you do this poll again after the World Cup, the numbers might vary slightly, but I still think that they would show a populace that is frustrated with the way things are going in Brazil.
And I just to quickly add, I don't think there will be many protests in terms of numbers. I don't see, as I think Toledo said here, I don't see 100,000 people on the streets. It's not going to happen. But I see the risk of violence. So there will be protests, no doubt about it. Not in terms of numbers, but in terms of violence. And you don't need too many people to create problems. If you have 500 very aggressive, very coordinated, very organized vandals or black blocs or whatever, you have a lot of trouble in your hands. So I think the 1 billion question now is how big will be these protests? But there will be protests, and there will be violence, some of them.
And just to add another thing, there is a gray area. When you just look at the number, I'm in favor or against something, people who are in the middle tend to go to one side or another. If you ask different questions, for example, We would like to change everything in federal government. We would like to change many things in federal government. We would like to change very small things, or you would like to change nothing. Well, when you ask that question, if you just put together those who want to change everything and a lot of things, it will have probably between 60 and 65, even 70% of Brazilians on that side. But if you look just for those who said, well, I like to change many things, then you will have 40%. The majority, the major part will be this one. And in this group, odd enough, 30% will say at the same time that they will vote for Dilma. So how do you explain this contradiction? You want to change many things, but you still say you'll vote for Dilma. How's that? And maybe the answer is because, one, their position is not well enough known, even though they are governors, they are politicians for a long time, they are not as known as Dilma. So we will see during the campaign, as people get to know them better, if they will improve their ratings among those who want change. And second of all, there are people who say, I want to change, but they are still in favor of the government because they are, in a way, trying to provoke the government to make changes, but to keep the government. So this is a gray area that it needs to be addressed in surveys too.
Yeah, we'll have 3 final questions. I will get them all at once because we are going to wrap up in 10 minutes, starting with Leticia. Then I see someone at the back there, yes, and then Margaret Hayes, and then we will come back to the panel. Leticia, please.
Okay, I have a quick question about, I wanted to ask Juliana if you think the impact of the social networks, what kind of impact do you think it might have had on the answers that you've received, especially because we see some new issues that in the past, for instance, foreign policy, I don't think that has been something that was very common in vis-a-vis elections. So, and on everything else as well, even the way the people are viewing the World Cup and the way the information goes so fast, especially because of the social networks and how Brazilians are so linked to social networks. I would like to ask you to share your views on that, please.
Okay, and then in the back there, and then to Margaret. Do you have 2 mics? No, just one. Carol, bring this mic to Margaret here on the front, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Flora Bracco from AM Global Consulting. I want to ask a slightly different question, building on some comments that we've heard from the correspondents in São Paulo. Clearly, a lot of the public discontent is tied to the government and its inability to tackle issues like transparency and corruption. So my question is, do you think that the private sector has a role in tackling these sorts of issues? Particularly, I'm thinking of programs like the partnership between Instituto Etos and Siemens, for example, in the program Jogos Limpos. So what does the public think about that? Does it have a good reception? And do you think it has a real impact?
Okay, and Margaret?
This question is for Juliana. Juliana, can you break, or have you looked at your data at the state level, particularly in terms of the top concerns and so forth? And is there a variation from state to state, or is there generalized agreement across Brazil?
Yes, who would like to, do you want to start? Juliana, go ahead.
Let me just answer first, since my answers are a little, it'll probably be a little shorter because they're more straight. So in the state level, unfortunately, we don't have that data because the way the sample is designed, and we have about 1,000 respondents, and so for us to really have confidence and be able to say something meaningful about each state, we'd have to have considerably more respondents, and we also would have had to design the sample in a way to be representative of each state rather than each region and then the country as a whole. So unfortunately, we don't have that data.
Region, do you have?
Yeah, we do have it by region, and when I looked at it by region, what it came down to was really the urban-rural difference. So it wasn't necessarily northeast, south, right? And so in the more, if you looked at all the more urban regions, you'd see less support for Dilma than in the more rural regions. But we do have the data available that we could share if anybody's interested in the regional breakdown in some of these questions. But we don't have it at the state level. As far as social networks. Is Richard still here? Richard Wyke was here until a little bit ago. He's our director of global research, and I know that there are other people within the global research team that's looked more at social networks, and I'm not sure if this year, but I would imagine that there are some questions in the poll about that. I know we've looked at it in Egypt and looked at the impact of social networks and the extent to which people use it to discuss various issues, including politics, and then more sort of everyday issues like sports and movies. We do have a report that I wasn't involved with, but if you go on our website, if you go to pewglobal.org, and I believe it came out either, Russ, you probably know, either late last year or early this year. There are some questions there about the use of social networks, but because that was a cross-national survey, it won't have very specific questions about Brazil, but it might give you a little bit of what you're interested in.
So let's go now in the reverse order, starting with Fabio and then Todd and Toledo, and ending here with Jeff. Please, Fabio.
I just wanted to make some comments on the social network question. We are still not very sure, I think, here in Brazil about what are the exact impacts of social network in all this phenomenon of the demonstrations and of politics in general. It's very hard to measure, but we do know they do have a very strong impact. Last year, during the wave of protests in June, social networks were very important in organizing these protests, because these were demonstrations that had no political direction. I mean, they were not controlled by one party or one politician. They didn't have one issue. They were multiple issues and multiple organizers of these protests. So social networks were the tool to organize these demonstrations. It's a very similar situation that happened during the Arab Spring in countries such as Egypt, Tunisia, and others, where especially Facebook, but others were very important tools to organize them. But we still don't know how they will play up. For example, during this presidential campaign, even though all major political campaigns and all candidates are paying very close attention to what happens in Facebook, because Facebook is the place to try to spread rumors and false accusations and so on. But I think we're still here in Brazil in the very early stages of using these and understanding the use of social networks.
Okay, thank you. Todd.
Just to touch on the question, I believe, about corruption, transparency, and the role of the private sector. In my view, and for sure in Brazil, I think the role of the private sector is important, and I think that's true with several issues. I think the private sector tends to push the envelope on issues faster than governments do, and put things on the agenda faster than governments can often do that. And I think in Brazil, the inroads that have been made against corruption have been helped tremendously by not just the private sector, but also non-governmental groups. Thinking of Contas Abertas, for example, that exposes public spending on issues and tries to get to the bottom of where money was skimmed off the top. It's probably that is probably not as ingrained and as developed in Brazil as it needs to be. But I think we're starting to see that, and I think for it to really make further inroads and be front and center, we're going to need to see more non-governmental groups in the private sector playing a role in that to really drive the conversation on it.
Well, you know, Brazil is the only country in the world where the public sector, all the corruption is only in the public sector. There is no corruption in the private sector, and of course, because as you see now, when you talk about Petrobras, the first thing that the Congress did in the investigating panel about Petrobras is to say, no, we'll not investigate the private companies that deal with Petrobras, because of course they are honest. And of course they also finance the campaigns who will be in this panel. So this is the role of the private sector in this corruption business, I think. Concerning the social networks, we've been studying this issue for quite a long time now. And what we can say is that, one, it's very, very important. Two, it's a war between the main parties. There's a very big war going on. If you ask here in YouTube or Google, they will tell you that the other day one of the parties was able to put down the channel of the other party in YouTube just because of the political election. And this is going to be worse in the coming months. This war is going to be bloody. And the other thing is that the utopia that the internet would be the perfect ground for you to establish a discussion about issues, to democratize the discussion, to put more people in the middle of the campaign, discussing what needs to be discussed. Well, this utopia is not what we thought it would be. What we've been seeing is that you have one side talking to themselves, the other side talking to themselves also, and nothing in the middle, nothing to join them but the old media. So fortunately, we still have a role in the thing.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Well, my colleagues have answered those questions so well, so maybe if I just conclude by just picking up on something that Toledo said earlier. And it's very striking as someone who hasn't lived in Brazil for a few years now, but we've had now 4 years of President Dilma. Over the last decade, the PT has moved so much closer intellectually to the sorts of positions that were defended by the PSDB. It is very surprising and quite a little depressing that still so much of the emotional energy about Brazilian politics is still this kind of argument, almost a feud between Lula and Fernando Henrique. That is still something that's still very, very kind of present, and you can feel it, and it is a little bit depressing that even after all these things that have happened, the political debate hasn't managed to move on in a much more substantial way.
Juliana, final word.
Well, I think everybody has touched on all the important points, but I do think that, we always say, I do a lot of work on our domestic surveys as well, and every time there's an election and it's June and people ask about it, and what's going to happen, and we always say, 6 months is an eternity in politics, and this year in Brazil that seems to be particularly the case, and that's almost an understatement to say it's an eternity, because it feels like there's so much that can still happen, and the World Cup is such a major event, and from the logistics, the protests, to so much that's been discussed here today. I mean, I think anybody who tries to predict what's going to happen in Brazil, like a month from now, let alone 5 months from now during the election, I think there's a lot that remains to be seen.
On that note, I would like to remind you of a phrase I heard recently from a professor at University of Brasilia at a meeting in University of Wisconsin, who said, "Brazil always does what you least expect." So we like to keep things interesting, and I think we will. Obviously, may we have safe games. And may the best team win. I know who the best team is, so thank you very much, and a round of applause for our discussions and our speakers. Thank you, guys in São Paulo. You were wonderful.
Thank you
Bye.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.